warmly welcome you here today to what I'm sure will be a very productive session on unlocking investment and financing tools to tackle biodiversity loss in the Asia-Pacific region and how to scale up the flow of finance. We have a wonderful panel here today, joining us both online as well as here in person. I will just deliver some opening remarks, and then also I really want to express my gratitude to our partners, Agence Française de Développement here, and particularly Monsieur Jean-Pierre Marcelli, who is the Southeast Regional Director and Thailand Country Director of AFD. So Jean-Pierre will speak just after me. This session, I think, for us signifies a important step in the ongoing discourse on finance, biodiversity, and the challenges around unlocking finance into conserving and protecting nature. We hope that our session today will answer 4 questions to understand the challenges better. Firstly, what are the drivers and barriers to biodiversity finance? How can governments and regulators help accelerate the provision of biodiversity finance? What role does biodiversity markets, such as offsets and credits, play in the provision of financing? And finally, how can more private capital be mobilized to accelerate biodiversity financing? So as we know, I mean, nature and biodiversity are the cornerstones of human well-being and sustainable development. There's an estimate that nearly 60% of global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. That's approximately 58 trillion of 105 trillion global GDP in 2023. So the alarming rate of biodiversity loss is a significant threat, not only to achieving the life on land, life on water, climate action SDGs, but to all of the SDGs. As the World Wildlife Fund Living Planet reports, we have seen a 69% decline in wildlife populations alone. Another estimate is that the World Bank estimates that without urgent action, biodiversity loss could lead to the collapse of essential ecosystem services, essentially causing a staggering global GDP loss of 2.7 trillion by 2030. That's in 6 short years. As most of us know, the landmark Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework commits to halting and reversing biodiversity loss, but successfully implementing its targets requires a substantial increase in the level of financial resources from all sources. That includes increases in international financial resources from developed countries to developing countries, but it also includes increased domestic resource mobilization from public and private sources. The 2030 State of Finance for Nature by UNEP and Environmental Program indicates that annual investment in nature-based solutions alone, it needs to double by 2025, next year. It needs to double by next year, and then triple by 2030 if we are to have any chance of meeting the targets set out in the GBF. And I'd also like to note within nature-based solutions, marine nature-based solutions is the most overlooked. SDG 14, Life on Water, is currently the least funded of all of the SDGs. And of course, tourism, trade, shipping, as well as fisheries depend on marine resources. So how do we fill this gap? Crucially, private finance investment must also increase significantly, as well as government expenditure. And although recent years we've seen a lot of new financial mechanisms, we've seen instruments addressing biodiversity loss, emerging markets such as offsets and credits, and increased interest by the private sector in investing directly in biodiversity. Currently, private finance for NBS, nature-based solutions, is only 18% of total NBS, and is less than 1% of private finance flows that have a direct harmful impact on nature. So private finance is currently 99% of private finance, unfortunately, has a direct harmful impact on nature, and currently it is a very small portion of total NBS flows. So we are not talking about additional private financing to come out of thin air. We are looking at how best to shift private capital, how best to reallocate private capital to fill this gap. And that requires a collaborative effort between governments and donors and the private sector, but it also requires better policies and regulation. despite an increasing demand for biodiversity projects, as well as, the increasing growth of biodiversity markets such as offsets, et cetera, we need robust science and regulation to ensure a good framework in these markets to avoid the risk of greenwashing, but to also really redirect capital the way that it needs to go. Many projects in our region in biodiversity, they do not currently meet established investment risk management data. So, of course, we need blended finance, which we will be hearing from, but we also need a host of other things, better data, to take up nature-related disclosure by the private sector, as well as integrating biodiversity risks into financial planning and especially financial risk planning. I suppose I should finally say that in all of this, biodiversity, unlike carbon markets where you have one, we're all talking about the same unit, which is a carbon emissions. Biodiversity is different from local markets and different from national and international markets. So there's a huge degree of complexity in these markets, and therefore tailoring local regulation and local policies and ensuring appropriate and clear government policies are crucial. And at the moment, what we're seeing is conflicting regulations that hinder the uptake of such projects. For example, sectoral policies that conflict with overall environmental and biodiversity goals. So we want to see that these nature-based solutions, biodiversity investments live up to their promise. But in order to do that, robust environmental and social safeguards are critical. 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity exists in land managed by indigenous people. So those whose ecosystems are being utilized must participate and benefit directly and tangibly. And co-benefits need to be generated, distributed, and all opportunity costs compensated for. ESCAP is committed to working with governments, with our member states, as well as with all stakeholders, to develop a comprehensive approach to unlocking sufficient finance to tackle the biodiversity gap. And I look forward to hearing the views of our distinguished panelists today and taking forward this work over the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suba, for your opening remarks. Now, allow me to give the floor to Mr. Jean-Pierre Marcelli, the director, regional director of the Agence Française for Développement. Jean-Pierre, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Suba and Pierre, and really, ladies and gentlemen, and guests. So very, very pleased and honored to be at this event, and thank you so to ESCAP for this invitation. Indeed, I think that it has been clearly said the importance of aligning biodiversity and nature and economy. Actually, this is really our main attentions, and we have to explore avenues to scale up the flow of finance. Where the trillions lie with conservation and protecting nature. And we know that the global biodiversity framework from Kunming, Montreal, so is calling from examples from elsewhere in the world to show and evidence that solutions are achievable for sustainable management. And I think that Asia and Pacific have really a strong responsibility for many reasons. First of all, this is the most vibrant economy in the world. This is where the growth is. This is where the most acute development I would say dynamics are at stakes, and indeed also a lot of nature assets and biodiversity hotspots and resources are staying. So, but we need to evidence it. We need to provide future-proof investments, and this is about transformative change. It's not just financing some nice projects, some nice conservation, just to have a sort of shop window, but really to be in a transformative process. And in this respect, we need a business alignment, we need a mobilization of the financial market, an alignment of the private sector, and involvement of the civil society for those, I would say, transition. And those transitions we know should be as just as possible, meaning not leaving the people next to the door, and because of just preserving nature. So that means in the same time targeting nature conservation and all SDGs together. So in this respect, we need to have a private sector heavily invested in this in biodiversity, whereas for the time being, it's mostly invested on traditional industries. I would say mostly, I would say business as usual, but it was like this a few years ago on climate change, and we really think that now it's a time to embark on this journey. To this respect, we need a deeper exploration of effective strategy. Example, engaging again the private sector, the financial sector, but the methods to do so require careful consideration. We should, with capacity building, stronger political involvement, and the recommendation from influential stakeholders are really necessary. With regulators, with banks, with investors, with assets manager who should be really embedded. As co-host of this side event, I trust the discussion will provide us with insightful exchanges at both national and regional levels. And I would like again to extend my heartfelt gratitude to ESCAP for their steadfast support of AFD Group in Southeast Asia, and particularly during the recent Finance for Biodiversity Forum, which took place with our partners from ONEP in Bangkok this week. So thank you for your commitment and dedication. And I would like to stress that, again, and to conclude that truly economy and financial sector in particular has a high dependency upon nature sustainability. I'm always telling to the business community, to the financial, to the bankers, to the central banks, there is a link between the sustainability of profits and the sustainability of nature. And so we need to shed light with that. And I think that analytical work with national and rural think tanks is very important. I think also that are beyond those risks, which are really happening. And I think that the Central Bank of France has conducted some works talking to this financial sector, saying, you guys, there are real risks on your business model, on your financial stability, if the collapse of nature is actually continuing. But there are also a lot of opportunities. We see that there is a lot of value for markets if you actually increase your nature, I would say, protection with better products, with better maybe margins, and also in terms of image. Shareholders are also waiting, and the customers more and more waiting for caring more for nature. And in this respect, Asia and the Pacific have to be to the forefront. What I would recommend, I think that what we recommend is, of course, sharing experiences from elsewhere, from everywhere in the world, from Latin America, from Europe, from Asia. And I think that actually ESCAP has got all the environment, all the space for it, and also capacity building, training in order to invent a new economy which will be sustainable for its own business model, but also for nature. So I wish you a very fruitful exchanges, and there will be, of course, definitely with ESCAP and with partners and with ADB listening to the findings of those discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, for your insightful remarks. And now we will start the panel discussion, which will be moderated by Dr. Patrick Martin. He is the Regional Advisor on Green Finance, Financing for Development Section, ESCAP. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Martin to continue with the panel discussion. Please, Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pierre. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. So just to start, I'd like to do some introductions to our distinguished panel that we have here today. To begin with, we have Mr. Anush Mehta. He is the country director of the Asian Development Bank's Thailand resident mission and leads a full range of the ADB's work. He was also former head of the ASEAN Catalytic Green Finance Facility, and prior to his current role, he established the Innovation Hub for Southeast Asia Regional Development of ADB, focusing on green and innovative finance. Next, we have in person, and I'll introduce, as you know, those in the room. We have people both in the room and online. So next in the room, we have Kun Pataren Tungsima, and she is the Director of Policy and Strategy section at the Biodiversity Management Division of the Office of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy and Planning with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. She is also a member of the Secretariat of Thailand's National Biodiversity Commitment. And thank you for joining us. Online, we're very fortunate to have Ms. Abibel or Abby Cruz Trinidad. She is the Senior Technical Advisor at the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, or BioFin, with the United Nations Development Programme, or UNDP. And with that, she provides technical advice to the implementation of BioFin methodology, including design of finance solutions to both public and private sector throughout the region and globally. Finally, online, we have Ms. Romy Godik Den Hertog. I hope that's okay. And she is the co-head of Nature Thematic at the United Nations Environment Programme for Finance Initiative, or UNEP-FI. Romy is the co-head of the Nature Thematic at UNEP-FI, and she leads work on nature-related risk and disclosure and manages the work on mainstreaming that work and capacity building. And we're very fortunate to have all our distinguished panel here today. So before I dive in, I'll just quickly describe basically the structure of the session. Is I'm going to ask each of the panelists a number of questions throughout and hopefully we can get some exchange. So if the panelists would like to add to somebody else's answer, please do. And then if we have a little bit of time at the end, hopefully we'll be able to also have a bit of Q&A potentially from the audience as well. And for those who are online, feel free. I understand that you can essentially post your questions, and we've received some prior to starting. Okay, so just to kick off, if it's okay, I have a common question for all the panelists, and I'll just, if we can start with Anosh, if that's okay. The question's really, what factors do each of you think actually drive or hinder biodiversity finance? And I thought I'd start with you, Anosh, if that was okay.
Sure. Hello to everyone. Good to see everyone here, and thanks for the introductions, Patrick. You know, the issue of biodiversity finance is much the same as any other sector, except of course it gets further compounded in terms of challenges. Two things really impede, I think, the flow of finance into this sector. And I think number one is, you know, the sheer missing pipeline of projects. You know, so it's one of those areas where, you know, the ability of sponsors, governments, private sector to put forward projects in the biodiversity space is super constrained. And therefore, there isn't a decent pipeline of projects. And I'm not even used the B word yet, which is bankable projects. Because even if there are projects which need to be put forward for biodiversity, and it's a mind-boggling array of areas and sectors, the bankability of those projects is even worse, because developing, you know, revenue lines for, you know, planting mangroves or seagrass or for, you know, the birds, the flyways sort of initiatives is super, super hard. So it's the ability of the projects to be developed well, including bankability structures in those projects, I think number two. And then number three is the sheer amount of competing projects which are already waiting in line to get finance from the global pools of money. So I'm not talking about just government and private sector, but everything globally, because money goes where the projects are well prepared and bankable. And therefore, there is already such a shortage in climate finance for infrastructure, your bridges and your ports and your roads, etc., where there's already a financing gap, that biodiversity, where the bankability is less assured, tends to get less flow of money. And, we are just opening, the discussion on things like biodiversity credits and, these innovative, sort of finance ways of how we can attract money to biodiversity. I mean, Jean-Pierre knows that I was talking about financing instruments for biodiversity just a few days ago. And many people on the panel told me, we lost you after you said innovative finance, because it's complicated. And therefore, what works is if you have a number of demonstration projects which eventually happen and show, okay, this is how Seychelles did their blue bond, and therefore can we replicate elsewhere? This is how Uruguay did their sustainability bond. And I think a lot more of that needs to happen by the governments, by development banks like us, before finance into biodiversity, I think, is mainstreamed, a word that we're all sort of trying to now sort of change the sort of the targets to. Until about COP, I think, Dubai, the focus has always been on general climate. And I think biodiversity has been sort of a little bit lost in that. But COP28, I think, was so critical, because I think I've never been to a COP where biodiversity was so much mentioned by everyone. We ourselves launched the Nature Solutions Finance Hub at COP. The head of the IUCN, Excellency Razan Mubarak, she sort of, strongly endorsed it. And now you see sort of this sense that a lot more needs to be done to create the innovative instruments, the projects, the bankability structures that should hopefully start getting over this challenge of flowing finance into biodiversity. Let me stop there, Patrick. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Anuj. Okay, Kun Pataran, turning to you, because I think we're going to get a diversity of views here, and I think that really will hopefully enrich our conversation. What are your views as to what factors do you think in Thailand particularly drive and hinder biodiversity finance?
Yes. For me, when you look at the nature and environment, you look at the way the nature work. So it's inseparable. Biodiversity and climate change is also inseparable. So I think one of the drivers to speed up the biodiversity finance is how to working jointly together between climate issues and biodiversity issues. Because as I can think of that for the driver, but for that those barrier that I can think of is first off, I think I can join with Dr. Anuj with the data. The data is very important for the implementation of biodiversity finance, because they are not in biodiversity itself, in the technical and scientific way, we don't have a complete data set on that. Most data is site specific. For investor, it's still a lot of limitations when you have to come with the list, dependency, and the impact on biodiversity. So because it's quite new concept for us in Thailand, and they don't have, so I agree that we need some best practice demonstration project in each particular area in order to go further with the biodiversity finance, and also the fundamental of the work as the entry for investment to biodiversity, such as taxonomy that exclusively applied for biodiversity is not here in Thailand. We have green taxonomy, yes, but we don't have specifically for biodiversity. So that's what we need in Thailand, just to lay the fundamental for biodiversity investment. And also the second barrier is understanding and awareness, because I have been in a lot of forums that talk about biodiversity. Even in the biodiversity, still public don't have awareness and enough understanding on what biodiversity is. When you come to financial sector, it's even more worse. Yeah, we speak the different language. So I think people do not realize how important biodiversity is, how to have a sustainable use of biodiversity. So I think communication is the key word here. How we communicate between communities of interest, different community of interest, to understand that biodiversity is connected to their living, their business, their life, and everything is related and depending on the nature in some way or another. Yes, that's my observation for this question.
Thank you very much, Kunpataran. Turning to you, Abby. Yeah, what are your views as to what factors do you think drive and hinder biodiversity in general? Obviously, we'll unpack more as we go through, but yeah, just generally.
Thank you. And good afternoon to everyone, especially to our co-panelists in this session. Thanks, of course, to ESCAP for inviting UNDP BioFin. So BioFin is a global program of UNDP which addresses the biodiversity finance gap using a standard methodology that is adapted by each country. The methodology culminates in the development of a biodiversity finance plan, which provides a roadmap for implementation of finance solutions. We are now working in 41 countries, implementing various types of finance solutions. And within the ESCAP membership, 16 countries in Asia and Pacific are already implementing finance solutions, while 9 more countries will start developing their plans with funding from the GEF. When we speak about barriers to financing, we need to unpack this as comprising the public sector and the private sector. The literature in biodiversity financing shows that 60% of global finance comes from the public sector. Yet, comparative studies across BioFin countries show that biodiversity spending accounts for an average of 0.2% to 0.25% of GDP. Although this trend is increasing, the numbers are still less than the 0.5%, which is the recommended percentage of the CBD to address the biodiversity targets. And this, we're still talking about the Aichi targets, by the way. So generally, what's the main barrier? I've been hearing already from our colleagues that first, there's lack of knowledge and lack of capacity. Those who work in biodiversity space do not know finance and vice versa. But I must say that the willingness to work in finance has greatly improved from the early years of BioFin. In 2016, 2017, there was really so much resistance for biodiversity colleagues to try to work in the finance space. Second, the lack of policy and institutional readiness, especially to support innovative financing mechanisms like payments for ecosystem services, offsets, or biodiversity credits. The last would be really the lack of financing to meet other basic human needs. And I am reminded of a colleague from the National Biodiversity Authority of India who says that there is never enough funding for biodiversity. Therefore, we need to think out of the box. Thus, one of India's signature solutions, and that of other countries as well, is mainstreaming. And I'm glad that we have already spoken about this term today. In the private sector, one issue is scale. We keep on hearing this scale because the transaction costs required to design and implement financing schemes will be the same, no matter how big or small the financing is. Of course, we allude also to the lack of an enabling framework for public and private sector participation. And of course, the private sector's earnings horizon is much shorter than the time frame for which a biodiversity investment can be recouped. So in general, from my end, I would say that those are some of the important barriers to unlocking finance, both in the public and private sector. And hopefully we can delve into it in the next segment. So I'll stop there, Patrick, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Abby. Okay, over to Romy. Again, just Romy, you know your general thoughts on what's driving our move to biodiversity finance and what's hindering us getting where we need to go.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, ESCAP, for inviting UNEP-FI to join for this panel session. Also, thank you for allowing us to join virtually. I want to take a step back first before I address your question and speak a bit more about UNEP-FI. So UNEP-FI is a UN-convened network of banks, insurers, and investment leadership catalyzing action across the financial system towards more sustainable and inclusive economies. We see that nature as a topic is trending among our membership for a number of years. And I think the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework played a key role in that regard, but also other developments such as the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which we helped to set up and supported through its developments in the past year. Within the nature thematic, we support financial sector action towards a nature-positive economy. And we do that in 3 broad buckets of work. We do that through mainstreaming action. We do that through assessing and disclosing nature-related risk. We do that through portfolio alignment. And we work on a number of leadership initiatives, such as on oceans, which are indeed the least funded SDG, but also on food systems. Whenever we speak about biodiversity finance, I often hear people say, you know, biodiversity finance, it's a new and developing asset class. But I think the reality is that we need to realize that this is the oldest asset class that exists, as our entire economic system depends on nature for everything. I really like the words of the Frank Alderson, who was on the ECB executive board, who says, you know, nature is not a hippie exercise, it's pure economics. So today we're focusing on biodiversity finance, which is very much a niche. But the question to us is also, how do we integrate more biodiversity in mainstream finance? So we often speak about this greening of finance, but it's also more about making regular finance more green. One of the things that the Dasgupta review has showed, that delaying the intervention into nature costs twice as much as actions now. So all stakeholders need to act. So I fully echo all of the interventions made by the other panelists. And I think from my side, just a few additions is, you know, if we want this asset class to mature, we need well-defined investment strategies. We need a proven track record. We need market participants, but we also need a supportive regulatory framework. So often if a new asset class develops, for example, nature-based carbon credits, they are more risky, and often this higher risk is paired with a higher return. But in the case of nature, the business case is often so uncertain that you know, really hampers investment. So we really need to mitigate these risks by developing a pipeline, as Anush said, with bankable projects to understand that risk better and to create high integrity markets. So with that said, I'm giving it back to you. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks so much, Romy. Okay, thank you to everyone. That is so insightful. So now I'll turn back to Anush, because we've obviously heard a lot of things that potentially hinder the move forward. But Romy just touched upon that need for a supportive regulatory framework and policies. So Anush, I was wondering if you could perhaps share some insights into policies that you think are needed to drive biodiversity finance, particularly driving, I guess, private sector involvement in biodiversity financing. And perhaps if you could offer, you know, instances of successful regulation or frameworks from different countries that have actually accelerated biodiversity finance in those countries or in the region.
Thanks again, Patrick. Yeah, happy to share, you know, from my experience. You know, I think just in terms of the policy levers that, you know, that are needed from governments, and echoing my colleague over here from ONEP, you know, certainly there is a need for very clear taxonomy, which defines the sort of projects that should be prioritized. I think that's kind of number one. And, you know, frankly, there isn't a lot of case stuff on this around that I can share with you, because, you know, I know, for example, that in fact, I think it's your team, Romy, which is working on a taxonomy for biodiversity, if I'm not wrong, which is, you know, exciting. I hope we can develop something here. but there isn't a lot. Now, IUCN, of course, has a biodiversity framework, but it's, of course, it's quite broad. It can be applied. We are working with IUCN in trying to develop something we hope for the Nature Hub in Asia Pacific. But I think that's a key lever to essentially make sure that the projects which are identified for financing, whether you call it nature-based solutions financing or biodiversity financing, are adhering to a clear framework with clear indicators. Otherwise, there's always the specter of the whole, greenwashing debate again coming out, just using old projects and getting finance to that. So I think number one lever, priority tool, framework, taxonomy, whatever you want to call it, for choosing the highest impact projects. I think the second lever is what I would call, sort of these enabling financing tools that the governments need to put in place. Now, in biodiversity and nature, there is, again, less information available, less examples available, but there are things that have been done in other countries on climate. So I always use the green finance facilities, de-risking funds that have been set up in Shandong province in PRC. Canada set one up for municipal. We've done it in Indonesia for green finance for Indonesia and PTSMI. And the basic essence of all the government de-risking funds is always the same, de-risk. And how you de-risk, that changes. So, whether we sort of use government money for financing upstream cost reduction in a project, CapEx, or whether we use it to basically provide funding for downstream, which is when the project is running, how to maintain that project, so-called operations and maintenance financing. But what it does is it essentially tells a financier. So let's say a bank is looking at a particular project. It assures the bank that the project is going to be able to repay the bank for financing the project because the government is providing a certain finance into those projects, upstream or downstream. I think that's number two for de-risking. And the third, which is the one which is the holy grail, is to put in place policies for actually converting what I call the value of loss into a revenue line. Let me explain that for a second, because it's so important. A lot of discussions, for example, on the old, what I'd call project financing for things like roads, right? We don't talk a lot about roads now for climate, but was about, can you build a road based on tolls, right? So user pays, right? Literally, and you can see it. So there's a revenue. But in biodiversity, there is no explicit revenue. There's only a loss which you avert. In Thailand, for example, the fishing industry, Cambodia, the fishing industry, if you don't do a lot about it, the fishing industry is in depletion. What is the value of that loss which you avoid by doing a biodiversity project? Can we therefore convert it into a dollar number? And therefore, can the government now support that dollar number which is being avoided with a slightly less amount of financing? So just trying to explain it in that. Now, how do you do that? Either the government has to raise money for this, for the fund, either from its budget or from that holy grail environmental taxation, right? So do you create an environmental fee for the coastal area, for hotels and tourism businesses, etc., which are going to benefit from this? Who do you apply it to? Do you apply it to the fisher people? Not sure, right? But environmental taxation is an area which is important to look at, to try and give a value to the loss which is avoided. That's number one. I think number two, this issue of biodiversity credits is also sort of not far away from it. It is the loss which you're avoiding. The question is it something like the carbon credit mechanism or something else? Carbon credits are quite turbulent sometimes, especially between Europe and Asia, difference in prices and valuations. So maybe. But essentially, I think those are the three levers that governments need to do. Before I finish, a lot of people will immediately ask about nature bonds. Let's do bonds. And there are examples of this. I think recently, Uruguay, very, very interesting bond structure over there. TNC, the Nature Conservancy, supports a lot of development of these bonds. And I think that's you would have heard a lot about rhino bonds. I know the UN is working on a tiger bond. Now, these are good ways of raising money from the market. Applying that money to projects is a whole different ballgame. It doesn't mean that if you raise that money that you can actually apply it to a project. And number two, is it even cheap enough? Because you're raising it from investors, from the commercial market space. is that money cheap enough to apply for projects where the revenue streams aren't there? So you need to therefore structure the bond carefully, and therefore the example of what they call the offset bond, sorry for the terminology, bonds which are being raised, for example, by TNC supported assistance in South America are very interesting. Because what they're saying is raise money from the market at a certain rate, let's say 12%, and then somebody, the World Bank, ADB, the government, reduces the cost of that bond when it is applied to a good biodiversity project, which shows, yeah, we've saved fish, or we've increased the amount of flyways available for birds. And that is an incentive-linked bond, which is a very, very interesting structure to take forward in biodiversity financing. I'll stop there. Hand back to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Anush. I wonder, just on that, because you covered off so much, so I just wanted to see if and you did mention, I think, in the beginning, so I just wondered if Romy wanted to add something, and I'll ask a question in that respect, Romy, because I know the work that you do, essentially this sort of, how do we encourage, so how do we move that economic decision-making to the relevant parties? And I know the work that you do on risk, around risk disclosure. So I was wondering if you wanted to add anything to what Anush has said, and more, is there some around the taxonomy, but also to my question, does the use of the reporting, and basically now that we have nature reporting, nature disclosure and reporting, does that change that in some way? Perhaps not, but I just open it to you.
Of course, thank you, Patrick. And first of all, let me respond to Anush's comment. Indeed, our colleagues at UNEP, Climate Finance Unit, in November issued a publication on green taxonomies for nature, and also within the LAC, so Latin America and Caribbean, we are working on a common framework for sustainable finance taxonomies that focus on nature conservation. To come back to your question, whether disclosure is going to move the needle, or at least that's what I read into it. I think disclosure is very important, and I always compare it to, when you want to become lighter or fitter, you need some sort of measurement scale. You can just do stuff, but you need to have a scale of measurement. And I think disclosure gives financial institutions, but also corporates and other partners, a way to kind of see where they are on their scale. At the same time, disclosure itself isn't a means to an end. And I think that's a fear that we have, and we are very much supportive of initiatives like the TNFD, but also other ways to measure impact, for example, through biodiversity footprinting that the PBAF promote. But I think we always need to keep in mind that this is a means to an end. Disclosure is not an end in itself. We do see the interest in innovative finance trending. So we see that it's a topic that is coming up quite a bit, but the market is still very, very small. So we are, together with UNDP, one of the founders of the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is really looking into how can we ensure that we create high integrity biodiversity markets, that the impacts, but also the role in the development of indigenous peoples and local communities is taken into consideration. And there we saw that the biodiversity credit market today stands at 8 million. So that's a very marginal market in which we're looking, which needs to increase, by nearly 1,000-fold to really realize the goals that it needs to have. But this high integrity is very important for us, whilst at the same time we need to scale that funding. So I think from my side, it's like flying the plane whilst we're building it. So we need to take action in all directions. And with that said, I want to hand it back to you. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Romy. Thank you. Yeah, very much. It is that learning by doing approach in this space, isn't it? We don't really have much of a choice, and given the how fast we have to move, and as you say, the scale with which we have to grow it. Just Abby, I can see you're nodding, so I was just wondering if you wanted to add anything. I think a UNDP got mentioned, so I just put it to you if you had any comments to add on. Yes.
Sure, thank you. No, I just wanted to add a little bit of information on taxonomies. I know that there's a lot of work in taxonomies going around the globe. UNEP is doing this, and there's been mention of Anuj, but I also want to say that we are developing a taxonomy, but this is for the public sector. And we think that it's almost like a white list of activities that the public sector should check against if they want to really contribute to the global biodiversity framework. So it would be useful for countries currently doing their NBSOPs. They can, they can use the taxonomy against their own NBSOPs to see where there could be gaps. And for our observation, there are early gaps already that we can find in sustainable use, in green economy, and pollution. And these are the traditional realms of the private sector. So I think it's really important to take note of all of these types of actions that can also address many of the actions that the private sector would do. So just, I'll leave it there for now, Patrick. Thanks.
No, thank you, Abby. Okay. Kun Pataran, we've heard, from the other speakers in terms of, and all representing sort of international organizations, I guess. So, what role can those international, from your perspective, what role can those international stakeholders play in supporting your own national policies for biodiversity finance? Is there something from your perspective that's really crucial, I guess?
Yes, I have to say that the international cooperation is very important to drive biodiversity finance in Thailand, because in the past they start with a lot of projects, if you can say like a eco-based, CASPA or something, that area-based approach of financial solution. And also right now we undergoing the development of the National Biodiversity Finance Plan with the UNDP Biofin. Yeah, I hope that plan can be an entry for any of finance policy that we are talking here and in the future to shape up the biodiversity finance in Thailand. And also with the biodiversity finance plan that developed along with the national biodiversity plan, we think that we can fill the gap and try to find the priority project that can be run according to the National Biodiversity Plan as well. And also, so I think to look at the international cooperation, I think we look at it is as a catalyst to the action, especially for biodiversity finance, and also a lot of technical support from this kind of cooperation, capacity building. I think some Lomi say that some of panelists say that we need to build up some institutional and national capacity to do the biodiversity finance. So that what we're looking for in the international cooperation. And I have to say about the event that we have on Monday, the Fin4Bio with the AFD and the other agency, a lot of partners in country and international organizations. So I think this marks the first step that we can join together internationally and nationally to work on and tackle the something like I like the say of Lomi that say we building the plane while we flying it. Yeah, I can feel that way because we don't know much about it, but we need to work on it. So I think working together will help it to be more clear, to be try to tackle the problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay, so I back to you, Abby. I think with this one, I'd like to hear sort of what kind, given all that, what kind of sort of nature finance outcomes have we achieved so far? It would seem to me there's, Anush mentioned some and Romy mentioned, but from your perspective, you know, what do you think we've actually achieved so far? We're in this sort of, you know, learning by doing, learning as we're flying the plane. So you know, what have we done so far?
Well, first of all, I want to stress that finance solutions don't just focus on resource mobilization. I think that's just one big aspect of it all. But let's not forget that we also need to look at, I think this is what Anuj really mentioned, is solutions that would help us avoid future costs, solutions that would help realign current expenditures, and we're talking here about probably harmful subsidies, and also solutions that make us use the resources more efficiently. So there are various ways of really looking at how to address the finance problem, because if we just focus on resource mobilization without looking at the leakage, then we're just like we're just fooling ourselves, no? But just to provide some meat to your earlier question, actually the types of solutions really vary across the different countries that are implementing them, and it's all context specific, and of course it depends on what kinds of policies are available for the countries to use. For example, we have been speaking about nature bonds. So in Indonesia, it was not a big nature bond. In fact, it was a big sukuk offering. I think it was about 200 million. So that's mainly for infrastructure. But we were able to carve out some money out of it to support biodiversity. So maybe, you know, that's one way of looking at these huge offerings where it will ultimately be used for renewable energy or perhaps infrastructure. But if we can carve out some money out of it and devote it to biodiversity, maybe that's one way of doing it. We are also working with countries like Indonesia and Malaysia on ecological transfer. So that's one way of realigning expenditures from federal to state. And this becomes more effective because the states are able to deliver better on their biodiversity parameters. Speaking of the policy framework, that is what we have done in the Philippines, where a recent law on the expanded protected areas has really provided more funding, public funding, to protected areas. So I think those are examples of how finance solutions can be developed. On the other hand, I'd like to point out one very important barrier on which is general economic and political environment. And we have seen this in 2 years ago in Sri Lanka when some of the finance solutions we have developed have been halted. We developed payments for ecosystem services where many hydropower plants were willing to pay and have started to pay upland farmers. But because of the downturn, they were not able to continue. So hopefully the economic situation happens sooner than later and we can resume these types of activities. So those are just some examples of finance solutions we have been developing and implementing in countries. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you so much, Abby. And Romy, I can see you'd like to make a comment.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, I wanted to go back to the question of resource mobilization because it's extremely complex to measure what is the global biodiversity funding gap, what does it consist of, and what is mobilized to date. But UNEP has its flagship report, the State of Finance for Nature, which really looks into global trends, into public and private investment into nature-based solutions. And I do realize that could be seen as an aspect of biodiversity finance. But what worries me is that the latest report that was issued around COP28 saw an 11% increase compared to the previous report. And I think we're moving too slow to close the gap. We can't be growing by 11%. It needs to grow much faster. And what was very interesting also is that this year's report didn't only focus on nature positive streams, but also very much on nature negative flows. And it showed that those nature negative flows are estimated at $7 trillion US last year, mostly 5 trillion of that coming from the private sector. But also, I think this is an area where public funding plays a huge role. So the investments that are nature negative made by governments outscope nature positive investments by a factor 10, even from public funding. And I know in Europe, where I'm based, those are a lot of these agricultural subsidies who, are harming farmers, are harming our environment, and are harming everyone at the end of the day. So I think that's very important to keep in mind, because the, nature positive markets are developing, but at the same time, we also have to look at these nature negative flows. So thank you.
No, thank you so much, Romy. Can I unpack that a little bit? Because I'm sort of fascinated by this, because and it goes to a question I was going to ask a little bit later in terms of the lessons and what we've learned from the experience from climate finance and carbon markets, and how that can be used in the development of biodiversity finance. It would seem to me that because on the carbon side, essentially under Paris, we had countries make their commitments, and very clear commitments to head towards various countries making their commitments. And then that dropped down to essentially in Europe, in many markets, then that dropped down to corporates having to mirror that commitment on the carbon side. Is that what we require per se on, and then that translated all of a sudden on the climate disclosure and risk management side, the corporates became committed to essentially their net zero targets? Not perfectly, but I use this in a, is that what we're going to require around biodiversity? That very clear commitment from the various nation states as to what they intend, and therefore corporates that operate within those nation states have to also mirror some of those commitments, and then that'll translate. Do you have a view on that, or anyone on the panel? I was just interested.
I'm happy to kick us off. So I think the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity is the lodestar of action, and it's like our last rescue for our planet, I would say. And what the GBF does, unlike its predecessor, the ACHI targets, is that it really looks at this whole of economy way of looking at the realization of the GBF. There's much more attention for the role of real economy and finance actors, for example, in Target 15, which looks into reporting. There is one very big but, in a sense, that climate isn't easy, but climate is easier because you have one unit of measurement, which is more or less agreed upon, which is greenhouse gases. But in nature, there are multiple indicators, and impact on nature will always be local. So I think in that sense, we'll see a similar process, but there is a lot of discussion within this field taking place to what is the unit of measurement for nature? Should there be a unit of measurement for nature? And then if we have that approach, how do we make sure that if organizations start applying it, that they cannot take shortcuts and make it easier for themselves, and they're actually doing the same thing? So I think we'll see the same process, but it will be different for nature, because nature is different than climate.
No, thanks, Romy. And I think this Anush made, I think, in one of the, actually, no, I think Kun Patara made the comment, it's about data and those sorts of things, and having actual information. Did anyone else want to add to that? And I guess I'll just ask the question more broadly. What can we learn from the experiences of climate finance in the development of biodiversity finance? I think, Anush, did you have a view on that?
Yeah, on the earlier point, I think, private sector and getting, there's already a move, right? A lot of discussions especially in Europe, on the sourcing of product going, for example, into supermarkets in London, right? And tagging that to ensure that the products are being originated sustainably. So the pressure that goes down onto companies involved in some facet of, getting the products from the nature, from the natural world, ensures that they start thinking about sustainable practices, sustainable origination of products, which is good because eventually you want 1,000 different solutions to start blooming in terms of ensuring sustainability. So, your point was really good, actually, Patrick, that I think involvement of the private sector with a little pressure in terms of ensuring sustainability of things is really good. We've seen this happen in other areas, sustainable practices, for example, in origination of material, right, which has impacted how farming, how companies source even material from cotton or from textiles in South Asia. So all of that is actually, I think, good. It's necessary, and it ties in exactly with what Romy says is define the unit of measurement that they can be measured against. But I think the point is super valid that sort of everybody should get involved in this debate sooner rather than later with clear measurables and deliverables. Today, on the climate finance issue that you raised, a lot of people ask this question, greenium. So if a government or a project entity does a green bond, are they able to raise money from the market cheaper because it's a green bond, not a black bond or a brown bond or something? No, you don't. The price of a bond is the price of a bond, whether it's green or black or brown. The difference is that a lot of investment will simply not flow if the underlying projects are not green. So it's becoming almost mandatory for investors that their investment should flow into climate or into something which is sustainable now. And I think that's a really good learning from the climate finance world, that the awareness that has been built in terms of ensuring that investments that come in for climate finance, the investments that come in for climate finance are not just a percentage, but 100% of an investor's portfolio, are driving the debate towards projects being climate resilient now. And I think the money talks, and therefore the availability of money puts pressure for the underlying projects to really be climate resilient. And I think that is a useful topic, a good learning from climate to essentially say nature bonds. Will it be a larger percentage of portfolios for investors? I think that's a good learning. The other learning is from carbon credits. And I think Romy sort of alluded to this earlier. Do we go in for what they call a tradable carbon credit model? Do we go in for an offset model? Or do we go for something which is a little simpler for biodiversity and nature, which is really focusing on the issue and the region and the country at hand rather than an offset model? And I think those are some things which I guess all of us are working on in terms of the credits model, and it not necessarily being exactly the same as the carbon credit model. But I think that's something you'll see more of as we go forward. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Anush. Excellent. Well, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I might try to open it to the floor. And I'll ask my colleague Pierre to help with if there are some questions from the floor. But I'm going to ask a question to Kun Pataran. Essentially, moving now, and I think Suba raised this point in her opening remarks. Essentially, the thing with biodiversity is much of it is held by often Indigenous communities out in local communities. So it's not something that is gated, as it were. Biodiversity spreads across a country very much so. It's a very rich thing. So recognizing that and the importance, I guess, of community participation, therefore, and making sure that the community buys into it, how can we foster positive community engagement in biodiversity financing?
Actually, I don't have much experience in biodiversity finance, but I think the work that I have to develop the national policies and plan on biodiversity, we engage a lot of stakeholders, and also one of them is a local community. So we try to engage them since the beginning of the project and have the close the dialogue with them in person and as a group as well, to ask them to state their need, their concern, and after that we try to respond to their concern that can build the trust and the way that we continuously communicate with them with the problem and try to tell them that what we're doing now, what we accommodate your thought, your concern into the plan. And I think this can apply to biodiversity finance as well. And if you allow, I can list up some case for the project that involved with the community participation because I think that case is come from like the help of the UNDP Biofin and Lak Thai Foundation in Thailand that work on Got Tau user charge. That way the local communities by the local administrative authority have learned and initiate the user charge by they have the local ordinance on for the peer service. Before that, Lak Thai Foundation spent several years to communicate with the communities and why they do that, they try to look through the relevant law and regulation of the government of Thailand that relevant to enact the ordinance and collect the money for environmental purpose, and they found out that they can enact the local ordinance for peer service. That happened in December of 2022 and implement in the next year. So at that time, we call a user charge for the tourists who enter Got Tau, and 20 baht collect for each tourist, captures 80% of tourists there in Got Tau. The revenue collect will allocate to Got Tau committee and local development plan. So they have a mechanism for money to allocate to environmental purpose, and the money will go to the activities such as waste management, coral preservation, and support local fishery. So I think thanks to their work, it can be one of the practice of the financial solution that we plan to expand this concept to the other area, probably work with the local communities more in Andaman Sea and might be able to apply it to the other part of the country.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So I just asked my colleague Pierre if anyone in the room if there is a question from someone in the room.
Yes, Patrick. Yeah, there's one person here. Please identify yourself and ask.
Thank you very much. I'm Montip Sriratana. I represent the National Research Council of Thailand. I would like to just mention about challenges and possible solutions in the financing challenges of nature-based solutions. The challenges that I could see is funding constraints, large gap between needed and available financing, government that manage natural capital are not well funded, private sector investment likely to come from MSMEs with limited access to credit. Second one is available financing limited, costly, and short-term projects are not viable and bankable, and that have high risk, low returns, require large upfront capital and long payback periods. And the other one is ecological benefits are not monetized and not reflected in the return on investment, and timeline for financial returns on nature capital investments are often longer than the tenure of traditional lending. So possible solutions that I would like to propose is the first one, viability and bankability. Use TAs to build pipeline of long-term programs with successful business models. Second is leverage, mobilize private sector investment and commercial funds. Carbon finance, carbon credits, biodiversity credit, like compliance market voluntary carbon market. The other one is bundle package, NBS, nature-based solution to lower the transaction costs like programmatic approach to offer integrated solution. Next one is de-risk projects, structuring by taking an upfront risk and rewarding private sector investors based on results. And the value of nature and ecosystem service need to be integrated in the financing instrument and engage private sector, especially the insurance industry. Explore possible use of insurance for restoration work to make the investment sustainable and resilient. And this can be a model to explore to other NBS contexts. And to match the financial sources with the scale of benefits and enhance return for FIS through fiscal stimulus, enhance government procurement system, and also local tax breaks and develop potential scenarios. So these are the possible solutions in addressing finance, especially NBS. The capacity content, I heard a lot this session talking about the government's lack regulatory and legal framework of the NBS and have limited experience. So I think this one, possible solutions for the government is to buy in from the government policy and enabling government environment properly, subsidy and the tax break. And the market development also need to be looked at. Plus, I'd like to ask ADB that I heard ADB is coming up with a platform for international and best practices NBS. So I don't know at the moment how NDB has already come up with this platform. Thank you.
Please.
I think just a very quick word on the platform, the Nature Solutions Finance Hub. We are in the middle of actually sort of setting up the hub, which will include a knowledge platform, which will share best practices on both NBS projects as well as innovative finance models from Africa, South America, and Asia, which we will be hosting out of our office in Bangkok. So that will start implementing from April, the knowledge hub part of it itself. And at that time, I'd be glad to invite you for sharing your experiences of the platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I don't think there's more questions here in the room, so maybe I'll let you wrap up the session. Thank you.
Okay, with that, just because I think we're just on time. I think we've got 1 more minute, so we've been perfectly on time. I'd just like to say thank you so much to our panel. I think that was a really their insights were very, very, very valuable. And we really appreciate their time and their effort to be part of our panel. We cannot thank them enough. And it sounds like we've got a lot of work to do going forward, but we're learning as we go, as it were. So thank you. If everyone could put their hands together to say thank you to our distinguished panelists. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, everybody. And the meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Have a nice lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much
day,
everyone.
To the speakers as well. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.